The crowd at Buckingham Palace froze. Gasps echoed across the square as the royal guard stood helplessly, his ceremonial sword now in the hands of a raging intruder. The man, a stocky figure with a shaved head and a scowl etched across his face, waved the blade wildly. Tourists scrambled to safety, some pulling out their phones to capture the chaos. The guard, who had sworn an oath to stand unflinchingly at his post, appeared torn between protocol and panic. "Step back or I'll use this," the man bellowed, pointing the sword at a group of tourists. The scene became even more surreal when another guard shouted a command, but before anyone could react, the intruder lunged forward with the stolen weapon. Screams pierced the air. But just as the blade was about to meet its mark, something unexpected happened. It all started earlier that day when Thomas, a middle-aged security officer, was assigned his usual post near the gates of Buckingham Palace. The day seemed routine, tourists lining up for pictures and asking questions about the guards who stood as still as statues. Thomas always admired their discipline and how they represented centuries of tradition. Among the crowd was Darren, a man who didn't blend in. His loud comments about the guards' race drew uneasy glances. Darren had always been bitter, blaming people of different ethnicities for his struggles. Today, his frustration boiled over into dangerous territory. "Look at them," he sneered loudly. "Foreigners, dressed up in British uniforms. A disgrace." Nearby tourists began to move away, sensing trouble, but Darren didn't stop. His taunts grew louder, targeting one of the guards who was black. The guard, as expected, remained stoic, his face betraying no emotion. But Darren wanted a reaction. "You called it a soldier," he jeered. "Bet you wouldn't even know what to do with that sword." Thomas approached cautiously, trying to defuse the situation. "Sir, I need you to calm down and move along," he said firmly. Darren wasn't having it. "Calm down? I'm just speaking the truth. This country's gone soft, letting anyone wear that uniform." Thomas radioed for backup, but before anyone could intervene, Darren made his move. In one swift motion, he leaped over the low fence separating the guards from the public and rushed toward the black guard. The tourists gasped in horror, some shouting warnings. The guard remained motionless as Darren closed the gap. Thomas ran toward the commotion, yelling, "Stop him!" But Darren was faster. He grabbed the hilt of the ceremonial sword with both hands and yanked it free from the guard's grip. The guard's training forbade him from engaging physically unless directly attacked, so he stepped back, his expression still calm despite the chaos. Now armed, Darren turned toward the crowd, brandishing the sword. He shouted incoherently about taking back Britain, his voice dripping with venom. The sight of him waving the sword sent people scattering in every direction. Thomas tried to reason with him from a safe distance. "Darren, put the sword down. This isn't going to end well for you." But Darren wasn't listening. "I'll show all of you what a real Brit looks like," he yelled, stepping closer to the crowd. The atmosphere grew tense. Parents grabbed their children and fled. Thomas's backup arrived, but even the armed officers hesitated. A ceremonial sword might not be sharp, but in the wrong hands, it could still cause serious harm. Darren's attention shifted to a group of tourists huddled near the gates, fear etched on their faces. He raised the sword, pointing it toward them as he advanced. "Run!" someone shouted, but the tourists were frozen in place. Just as Darren lunged, a bystander, a young woman, who had been filming the entire incident, stepped forward, holding up her backpack like a shield. The sword came down hard, slashing through the fabric and spilling its contents onto the ground. Darren stumbled back, caught off guard by her sudden bravery. In the split second of confusion, Thomas saw his chance. Drawing on years of training, he rushed Darren, tackling him to the ground. The sword clattered against the pavement as the two men wrestled. Darren fought like a man, possessed, shouting obscenities and thrashing wildly. The backup officers closed in, finally pinning Darren down and securing the weapon. The young woman who had intervened stood off to the side, shaken but unharmed. As the officers hauled Darren away, the black guard resumed his post, his composure unbroken. Tourists began to emerge from hiding, murmuring about the bravery they had just witnessed. But as Thomas caught his breath, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Darren's parting words echoed in his mind. "You think this is it? You haven't seen the last of me." What had started as a day like any other had turned into an event that would haunt Buckingham Palace for years to come.
And as Thomas
looked at the shaken crowd, he knew this was just the beginning. Suddenly, a commotion erupted from where Darren had been taken. A loud crash echoed through the square, followed by shouts from the officers. Thomas turned, his heart sinking as he saw what was happening. Thomas turned toward the commotion, his pulse racing. 2 officers had been escorting Darren to a waiting police van, but now they were grappling with him on the ground. Darren had somehow slipped one hand free of the cuffs and was fighting ferociously, screaming like a wild animal. "Get him under control," one officer yelled. But Darren was relentless. Before anyone could intervene, Darren lunged toward the van's open door and disappeared inside.
The
officers scrambled to pull him out, but it was too late. A deafening roar filled the air as the engine started.
Darren,
having spotted the keys still in the ignition, was now in the driver's seat. "Stop him," Thomas shouted, but the van lurched forward, its tires screeching against the pavement. The crowd scattered again, screams erupting as Darren aimed the vehicle toward the gates of Buckingham Palace. Tourists clung to each other, unsure of where to run. The guards at the gate, momentarily stunned, sprang into action. They lowered their weapons and shouted commands, but Darren wasn't slowing
down.
His face was a twisted mask of rage as he drove straight at the historic gates. Thomas grabbed his radio, his voice steady despite the chaos. "We've got a rogue suspect in a police van heading for the palace gates. Need immediate backup." The van smashed into the gates with a bone-rattling crash, metal bending and sparks flying. Darren stumbled out of the vehicle, dazed but still defiant. He picked up a shard of twisted metal from the wreckage and waved it at the approaching guards, shouting incoherent threats. "You won't take me alive," he bellowed, his voice raw with anger. Thomas, along with several other officers, moved in cautiously. Darren's erratic behavior made him unpredictable and dangerous. The guards closed ranks, forming a protective line in front of the palace entrance. Darren swung the metal shard wildly, his movements erratic and frenzied. One of the guards stepped forward, his rifle trained on Darren, and issued a final warning.
"Drop
the weapon and lie face down on the ground." For a moment, it seemed Darren might comply. He looked around, taking in the sheer number of officers and guards now surrounding him. But instead of surrendering, he let out a primal scream and charged at the nearest guard. Time seemed to slow. Thomas could see the horror in the guard's eyes as Darren closed the
gap.
Then, with a single well-placed strike, the guard used the butt of his rifle to knock the shard from Darren's hand. Darren crumpled to the ground, clutching his wrist. The officers pounced, pinning him down and securing him in heavy-duty restraints. This time, there would be no escape. The crowd erupted in applause, but the tension in the air remained thick. Thomas surveyed the scene, his mind racing. The damage Darren had caused was significant, not just to the gates and the van, but to the sense of safety that Buckingham Palace represented. As Darren was loaded into a reinforced police van, this time under the watchful eyes of heavily armed officers, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just an isolated incident. Darren's words earlier, about showing the country what a real Brit looked like, seemed to hint at something larger. Was he acting alone, or was there more to this than met the eye? The day's events left everyone on edge. Tourists hesitated to approach the palace, even as the guards resumed their posts. Thomas stayed on duty, keeping a sharp eye on the crowd. Every movement seemed suspicious now, every glance a potential threat. Hours passed, and the chaos began to subside. The damaged gates were cordoned off, and a repair crew arrived to assess the situation. Darren was gone, locked away in a high-security facility, but the uneasy atmosphere lingered. As night fell, Thomas was finally relieved of his post. Exhausted, he headed back to the security office to file his report. The other officers were still buzzing about the incident, speculating about Darren's motives and whether he had accomplices. "Did you hear what he was shouting?" one officer asked. "He kept saying something about a bigger plan." Thomas frowned. He hadn't heard that during the arrest, but it didn't surprise him. Darren's behavior had been too calculated to be purely impulsive. There was something deeper, driving his actions, and Thomas had a sinking feeling they hadn't seen the last of it. Just as he was about to leave for the night, Thomas's phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. He hesitated before opening it, a chill running down his spine. The message was short but chilling. "This isn't over. The real fight begins soon." Thomas's hands trembled as he stared at the screen. Who had sent it? And what did it mean? Before he could process it, an officer burst into the room, his face pale. "Thomas, you need to see this." He followed the officer to a monitor showing live security footage of the palace grounds. His heart sank as he saw a shadowy figure scaling the damaged gates. The fight wasn't over after all.
Thomas
Stared at the monitor, his pulse quickening. The shadowy figure was nimble, vaulting over the twisted metal of the damaged gates with ease. The feed was grainy, but the figure's movements were deliberate, almost too confident. "Sound the alarm," Thomas said, his voice firm. "We've got a breach." The officer beside him slammed his hand down on the emergency button, triggering a shrill alarm that echoed through the palace grounds. Guards and officers on duty sprang into action, sweeping the area with flashlights and weapons drawn. The figure disappeared from the camera's view, slipping into the shadows. Thomas grabbed his radio. "This is Thomas. Intruder spotted on the east side of the gates. Suspect is on foot and possibly armed. Proceed with caution." He didn't wait for a response. Thomas grabbed a flashlight and his baton, then headed toward the gates. His instincts told him this wasn't a random trespasser. The precision and timing of the breach suggested planning and perhaps a connection to Darren. As he approached the gates, he heard the crunch of gravel behind him. He spun around, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, but saw nothing. His grip on the baton tightened. "Thomas, you." "Good," a voice crackled through his radio. "I'm fine," he replied, though his heartbeat was anything but steady.
"Keep eyes
on the perimeter. Whoever this is, they're trained." He moved cautiously along the perimeter, his flashlight sweeping across statues and hedges. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional chirp of distant crickets. Then, just as he was about to call for backup, a faint sound caught his attention, a soft clinking of metal, like a chain being
dragged.
Thomas froze, listening intently. The sound was coming from the old stables, a structure that hadn't been used in years, but still housed several artifacts of historical significance. He approached the building slowly, his footsteps silent on the gravel. The door to the stables was ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. He peeked inside, his flashlight revealing rows of dust-covered stalls and cobwebs draped over wooden beams. The clinking noise was louder now, echoing through the cavernous space. "Whoever's in here, come out with your hands up," Thomas called, his voice echoing off the walls. No response. Thomas took a step inside, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The beam landed on something shiny. A ceremonial mace, one of the artifacts stored in the stables. It had been removed from its display case and was now lying on the floor, as if abandoned in haste. He picked it up cautiously, examining it. The intricate designs etched into the metal glinted in the light, but what caught his attention was the fresh smear of fingerprints. Someone had been here.
And recently.
A sudden noise behind him, a loud crash, made him whip around, baton raised. The door he'd entered through had slammed shut. Thomas's flashlight flickered as he stepped back toward the exit, his eyes scanning for movement.
The
clinking sound returned, louder now, accompanied by footsteps. Whoever was here wasn't hiding anymore. "Show yourself," Thomas barked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. A figure emerged from the shadows, dressed in black from head to toe. Their face was obscured by a balaclava, but their posture was aggressive, shoulders squared and fists clenched. In one hand, they held a crowbar. Thomas didn't wait for them to make the first move. He swung his flashlight toward their head, aiming to disorient them, but they were faster. The figure ducked and swung the crowbar, narrowly missing Thomas's leg. The two circled each other in the dimly lit stable, their footsteps crunching on the hay-strewn floor. Thomas could feel the tension in the air, like a rubber band stretched to its limit. "Who are you working with?" he demanded, trying to buy time. The intruder didn't answer, lunging at him instead. Thomas dodged, using his baton to deflect the blow. The force of the impact sent vibrations up his arm, but he held his ground. Their fight was brutal and clumsy, the confined space making every movement a gamble. Thomas managed to land a blow to the intruder's ribs, eliciting a grunt of pain, but the figure retaliated with a swift kick to his knee, sending him stumbling backward. As Thomas struggled to regain his footing, the intruder bolted for the door. Ignoring the pain in his knee, Thomas gave chase, bursting out of the stables just in time to see the figure vault over a hedge and disappear into the darkness. Officers arrived moments later, their flashlights cutting through the night. "Suspects on the run," Thomas panted, pointing in the direction the intruder had fled. "They're fast. Might still be armed." The officers split up, combing the grounds, but Thomas knew they wouldn't find anything. Whoever this was, they'd had an exit strategy. He limped back toward the stables, replaying the encounter in his mind. Something about the intruder's movements felt practiced, deliberate. This wasn't a random break-in. Inside the stable, he examined the disturbed display cases more closely. Several ceremonial weapons were missing, including an antique dagger and a musket. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. These weren't just thefts, they were provocations. Whoever was behind this wanted to send a message. As he reported the incident to his superiors, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Darren's earlier rampage had been chaotic, but this was calculated. And whoever was orchestrating it wasn't done yet. Later that night, as Thomas reviewed the security footage in the control room, something caught his eye. The intruder had been careful to avoid cameras, but one brief frame showed them turning their head just enough for a logo on their jacket to be visible, a coiled serpent, surrounded by the words, "The Purity Order." Thomas's blood ran cold. He'd heard whispers about this group before, a shadowy organization with ties to extremist ideology. But if they were involved in this, it meant the stakes were far higher than anyone had imagined. Before he could process it, his phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. "You're getting warmer. Sleep tight." Thomas stared at the message, his mind racing. The audacity of it sent a chill down his spine, but there was no time to dwell. He immediately forwarded the message to his superiors and flagged it for the cybercrime division. Whoever was taunting him had crossed the line from random chaos to calculated terror. The name, the Purity Order, gnawed at him. He remembered a briefing months ago, whispers of a radical group tied to racial purity and nationalistic extremism. They were known for carefully orchestrated acts of violence, often symbolic, aimed at sowing division and fear. If Darren had been acting under their influence, the situation was far more dangerous than it seemed. That night, Thomas barely slept. Every sound outside his window made him flinch. Every shadow seemed to move. By morning, he was back at the palace, determined to uncover the truth. The palace grounds were bustling with activity, repair crews working on the damaged gates while additional security patrolled the area. Thomas met with his commanding officer, Inspector Graham, who was visibly tense. "You've seen the footage," Graham said, motioning toward the monitors in the control room. "This wasn't random. This was a coordinated effort." "I'm starting to think Darren wasn't acting alone," Thomas replied. He pulled up the frame showing the intruder's jacket logo. "This group, the Purity Order, they're organized. Darren's rampage was just the beginning." Graham nodded grimly. "We're already digging into their connections. But we need to know why they're targeting the palace. What's their endgames?" Before Thomas could respond, an officer burst into the room, holding a tablet. "Sir, you need to see this." The officer played a video that had just been uploaded online. The grainy footage showed Darren, still in custody, sitting in what appeared to be a makeshift interrogation room. He was handcuffed to the table, but his smug grin suggested he didn't feel restrained at all. "People of Britain," Darren said, leaning toward the camera. "You've been lied to. Your traditions, your identity, stolen by outsiders. But don't worry. The Purity Order is here too. Take it all back." The video cut to a montage of ominous images, historical landmarks, flags, and shadowy figures training in remote locations. It ended with a chilling message: "We reclaim what is ours. The fight begins now." Thomas felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The video was already gaining traction online, with comments ranging from support to outrage. It was exactly the kind of division the group thrived on. "Trace the upload," Graham ordered the tech team. "Find out where this came from." Thomas left the control room, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on him. As he stepped outside, the air was cold and damp, the kind of weather that seeped into your bones. The tourists had thinned out, but the atmosphere was tense. Even the guards seemed more alert than usual, their eyes scanning the crowd for anything suspicious. Later that afternoon, Thomas received a call from one of the tech analysts. "We traced the video upload to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of London," the analyst said. "Coordinates are in your inbox." Thomas immediately relayed the information to Graham, who authorized a raid. Within the hour, Thomas found himself riding in the back of an unmarked van with a team of tactical officers. The warehouse was in a derelict industrial area, surrounded by crumbling buildings and overgrown weeds. The team approached cautiously, their footsteps silent on the cracked pavement. Inside, the warehouse was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of mildew. Flashlights swept across the space, revealing graffiti-covered walls and scattered debris. It looked abandoned, but Thomas's gut told him otherwise. "Spread out," the team leader whispered. "Check every corner." Thomas moved carefully, his hand hovering near his holstered weapon. The warehouse was eerily silent, save for the faint creak of rusted beams overhead. Then, near the back of the building, he noticed something out of place, a stack of crates covered with a tarp. He signaled to the others and approached the crates. Lifting the tarp, he uncovered a disturbing sight. Weapons, dozens of them, ranging from knives to firearms. There were also blueprints of the palace and detailed notes about guard rotations and security protocols. "This isn't just a hideout," Thomas muttered. "This is a staging ground." Before anyone could respond, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse. Thomas spun around, his flashlight catching a figure bolting toward an exit. "Stop," he shouted, giving chase. The suspect was fast, weaving through the maze of crates and machinery. Thomas pushed himself to keep up, his adrenaline overpowering the fatigue in his legs. They burst through a side door into an alley, the sudden daylight blinding him momentarily. The suspect ducked into a narrow passage between buildings. Thomas followed, his heart pounding. He could hear the footsteps, growing louder, closer, and then the suspect turned, raising a weapon. It wasn't a gun, it was a makeshift pipe bomb, the wick already lit. "Stay back," the suspect shouted, his voice trembling. Thomas stopped in his tracks, his mind racing. The suspect's hands were shaking, the flame on the wick flickering dangerously close to the device. "You don't have to do this," Thomas said, his voice steady. "Put it down.
We can talk.
The suspect laughed bitterly.
Talk.
"You think talking will change? This is bigger than you. Bigger than me." In that moment, Thomas realized he wasn't just dealing with a fanatic. He was dealing with someone who truly believed they were part of something larger. The suspect took a step back, his eyes darting between Thomas and the exit. Then, without warning, he hurled the bomb. Time seemed to slow. Thomas dove to the ground, shouting a warning into his radio. The bomb hit the wall behind him and exploded, the force of the blast throwing him forward. His ears rang as debris rained down around him. When the dust settled, Thomas pushed himself to his feet, coughing and disoriented. The suspect was gone, but the message was clear. The purity order wasn't just threatening chaos. They were ready to unleash it. And this was only the beginning. Thomas leaned against the crumbling wall, catching his breath. His ears still rang from the explosion, and his chest ached from the impact. He scanned the alley, but the suspect had vanished, leaving only a trail of destruction. The scent of burnt debris lingered in the air, mixing with the metallic tang of blood from a shallow cut on his forehead. "Thomas, report." Graham's voice barked through the radio, jolting him back to reality. "I'm fine," Thomas replied, though he wasn't entirely sure. Suspect escaped. They had an improvised explosive, small but effective. "Any injuries?" "Just a scratch," he said, wiping the blood from his face.
But
"We've got a major problem. This group isn't just planning. They're ready to act." There was a pause on the other end.
Get
"Back to base. We need to regroup." Back at headquarters, the team gathered in the conference room. The atmosphere was heavy, the air crackling with tension. On the table were photos of the weapons cache, blueprints, and other evidence recovered from the warehouse. A projector displayed the logo of the Purity Order, now officially linked to the attack. Graham stood at the head of the table, his face grim. This isn't just a fringe group playing soldier. They're organized, well-funded, and they've been planning this for months. Thomas rubbed his temples, exhaustion threatening to overtake him. The question is, why the palace? What's the significance? A young analyst, Ellie, raised her hand. "I've been digging into their online activity. They've been using coded language, but one phrase keeps popping up: the crown falls." The room fell silent. "They're targeting the monarchy," Graham said finally, his voice low. "Not just symbolically, physically." Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine. "You think they're planning an assassination?" Ellie nodded. "It's a strong possibility. Their rhetoric is centered on restoring a pure Britain, and they see the royal family as complicit in what they consider the erosion of their culture." "Do we have a timeline?" Thomas asked. Ellie hesitated. "They're being careful. But if the warehouse was their staging ground, they're close." Graham's jaw tightened. "We need to secure the palace and increase surveillance. Thomas, I want you leading the ground team. We can't afford any mistakes." That evening, Thomas stood outside Buckingham Palace, watching as additional security measures were put into place. Armed officers patrolled the perimeter, while surveillance drones buzzed overhead. The damaged gates were now reinforced with steel barriers, and every visitor was thoroughly screened. Despite the heightened security, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that they were one step behind. The Purity Order had proven their ability to evade detection, and their willingness to use violence made them unpredictable. As night fell, Thomas and his team conducted a sweep of the palace grounds. The tension among the guards was palpable, their usually stoic faces betraying unease. Even the tourists seemed subdued, their chatter hushed as they passed by. Around midnight, Thomas received a call from Ellie. "We found something," she said, her voice urgent. One of the blueprints had faint markings that weren't visible at first. "When we enhanced the image, we discovered a hidden route." "What kind of route?" Thomas asked, already dreading the answer. "A tunnel," Ellie replied. "It's old, probably from World War II. It leads directly into the palace. Thomas felt his stomach drop. How did we miss this?
It's.
Not on any modern maps, Ellie explained.
But if they know about it.
They could already be inside. Thomas finished his voice grim. Send me the coordinates. Thomas and a small team descended into the tunnel system, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air was damp and suffocating, and the sound of dripping water echoed around them. The passage was narrow, the walls lined with crumbling brick that seemed to close in as they moved deeper underground. Stay alert, Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of their boots on the uneven ground. The team pressed on, the tension mounting with every step. The tunnel twisted and turned, leading them into a large chamber. In the center of the room was a table covered with maps, tools, and a radio transmitter. It was clear someone had been here recently. Clear the area, Thomas ordered, scanning the room for clues. One of the officers called out, holding up a sheet of paper. Sir, you need to see this. Thomas took the paper and read it quickly. It was a detailed plan, outlining an attack on the palace, scheduled for the following evening. The document included precise times, targets, and even escape routes. They're not just targeting the monarchy, Thomas said, his voice tight. They're targeting the guards and security forces too. They want maximum casualties. Suddenly, a faint noise echoed from one of the adjoining tunnels, a shuffling sound, followed by a low whisper. The team froze, weapons drawn. Who's there? Thomas called out, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. The only response was silence. Move in pairs, he instructed. Sweep the tunnels. They could still be here. As the team split up, Thomas and another officer headed toward the source of the noise. The tunnel grew darker and narrower, the air thick with tension. Thomas could feel his heartbeat in his ears as they rounded a corner. Out of the darkness, a figure lunged at them, swinging a metal pipe. Thomas barely had time to react, raising his arm to block the blow. Pain shot through his forearm, but he managed to shove the attacker back. The figure darted into the shadows, but not before Thomas saw their face, a young man, barely out of his teens, with wild eyes and a look of desperation. Don't let him get away, Thomas shouted, giving chase. The suspect weaved through the tunnels with an agility born of familiarity. Thomas struggled to keep up, the maze-like passageways disorienting him. Just as he thought he'd lost the trail, he heard a metallic clang ahead. The suspect had tripped over a loose pipe, sprawled on the ground. Thomas moved in his weapon, trained on the young man. Don't move. But instead of surrendering, the suspect laughed, a chilling, hollow sound. You're too late, he said, his voice laced with defiance. The plan is already in motion. Before Thomas could respond, the young man pulled something from his pocket, a detonator. Thomas's eyes widened. No. The young man pressed the button. A deafening explosion rocked the tunnels, the force of the blast throwing Thomas backward as the world around him erupted in chaos. Thomas's ears rang, drowning out everything else. The world was spinning, dust and debris filling the air. He struggled to move, his body pinned beneath a heavy slab of brick. Coughing, he clawed at the rubble, adrenaline overriding the pain in his limbs. Thomas, can you hear me? A distant voice crackled through his radio. He reached for it, his fingers trembling. I'm alive, he rasped. What's the situation? We felt the blast topside. Graham's voice came through, frantic. The palace shook. What's your status? Any injuries? Trapped, Thomas managed. Suspect detonated an explosive. Unknown. Casualties. Tunnel integrity. Compromised. We're sending a rescue team, Graham assured him. Hold tight. Thomas leaned back against the rubble, his flashlight flickering. The tunnel walls groaned under the pressure of the explosion, loose bricks falling intermittently. Somewhere nearby, He heard muffled groans. Another survivor. "Hello? Can you hear me?"
Thomas.
Called out, his voice echoing through the damaged tunnel. A faint reply came back, weak and pained. Over here, ignoring the protest of his battered body, Thomas began dragging himself toward the sound. His hands scraped against jagged rocks, but he pushed through, his flashlight barely illuminating the way. Finally, he spotted a figure half buried under debris. One of his team members. "It's okay," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "I've got you." He cleared the rubble, as best as he could, freeing the officer's legs. The young man winced but nodded, his face pale. "I thought I was done." He muttered. "Not today," Thomas replied, helping him sit up. "Can you walk?" "Barely."
We don't have a choice.
This tunnel's unstable. We need to move." Above ground, chaos erupted as the explosion sent shockwaves through the palace. Tourists screamed and fled, and the guards immediately went into lockdown. Smoke rose from a section of the palace lawn, where a hidden tunnel entrance had collapsed, leaving a jagged hole in the ground. Inside the palace, the royal family was swiftly moved to a secure location, their safety the top priority. Graham coordinated the response, his voice cutting through the confusion. "Seal off all entrances. Nobody in or out without clearance." Ellie rushed into the command center, clutching a tablet. "I've intercepted a transmission," she announced. "It's from the Purity Order." She played the audio.
A
distorted voice filled the room. The blast was a warning. Next time the monarchy falls, the message ended, leaving an ominous silence in its wake. "They're escalating," Graham said grimly. "This isn't just about sending a message anymore. They're preparing for a full-scale assault." Back underground, Thomas and the injured officer inched their way through the unstable tunnels, every step a calculated risk. The air was thick with dust, making it hard to breathe. The distant sound of rushing water suggested a breach in the underground drainage system. "We need to hurry," Thomas said, his voice tight. "If the water floods in, we're finished." As they moved, Thomas's flashlight caught something ahead, a faint glimmer. He squinted, realizing it was another piece of the Purity Order's plan. On the wall was a map etched into the brick, marked with symbols and routes. At the center was the palace, encircled with red lines. "This isn't just a single attack," Thomas muttered, studying the map. "They've got contingencies." The injured officer leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. "What does it mean?" "It means they're smarter than we gave them credit for," Thomas replied. "We're dealing with professionals, not amateurs." The ground beneath them trembled, snapping Thomas back to reality. The tunnel was collapsing, the structural damage from the explosion finally taking its toll. "Move," Thomas shouted, grabbing the officer and dragging him forward. They barely made it a few feet before a section of the ceiling gave way, blocking their path. Panic surged in Thomas's chest. Their way out was gone. He scanned the area, desperate for an alternative. His flashlight caught a metal grate in the corner, partially obscured by rubble. It looked like a drainage tunnel, narrow but passable. "This way," Thomas called, pulling the officer toward it. They pried the grate open, the rusty metal groaning in protest. The smell of stagnant water hit them immediately, but there was no other choice. Thomas crawled in first, pulling the officer behind him. The tunnel was claustrophobic, the walls closing in as they moved. Water trickled beneath them, a chilling reminder of the rising flood risk. Every sound, a creak, a splash, a distant rumble, set Thomas's nerves on edge. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they emerged into an open chamber. It was a maintenance area with a rusted ladder leading to a hatch above. Thomas helped the officer to his feet. "Can you climb?" The man nodded weakly. "I'll manage." They ascended the ladder, every rung an agonizing effort. When they pushed open the hatch, fresh air hit them like a blessing. They emerged on the palace grounds, near a secluded section of the garden. The area was swarming with guards and emergency personnel. "Over here," Thomas shouted, waving for help. Medics rushed over, helping the injured officer onto a stretcher.
Thomas sank
To the ground, his legs barely supporting him. Graham appeared moments later, his expression a mix of relief and concern. "You made it," Graham said, clapping a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "What happened down there?" Thomas shook his head. "They're smarter than we thought. This wasn't just an attack, it was a diversion. They wanted us chasing shadows while they finalized their real plan." "What plan?" Graham asked, his voice tense. Thomas looked up at him, his face pale. "They've got more explosives. And they're already inside the palace." Inside Buckingham Palace, as security swept the halls, a faint beeping sound went unnoticed. Hidden in the ornate molding of a grand ballroom was a small, inconspicuous device. Its digital timer ticked down, second by second. The digital timer ticked relentlessly, hidden among the intricate carvings of the grand ballroom. Guests attending a private evening event were unaware of the lurking danger. The sound of violins filled the air, their melody masking the faint, insidious beeping. Thomas was back in the control room, briefing Graham and
Ellie.
The map in the tunnels wasn't just a rough plan. It showed exact placement points for their explosives. If they've already planted them, we're running out of time. Ellie's fingers flew across her keyboard as she accessed the palace's internal schematics. "We need to locate those bombs fast. If the ballroom is part of their target, they could take out everyone inside."
Thomas felt his chest tighten.
"What's happening in the ballroom right now?" Graham looked grim. "A state dinner. Diplomats, royals, military leaders, all in one place. Exactly the kind of target they'd want," Thomas muttered. He grabbed his radio. "We need a discreet evacuation of the ballroom. If we rush in and panic everyone, we could tip them off." Graham nodded.
"Do it."
"Ellie, alert the bomb squad." In the grand ballroom, the evening was in full swing. Laughter and clinking glasses punctuated the music. Uniformed guards stood at the entrances, their gazes scanning the room, unaware of the imminent threat. Thomas entered through a side door, his demeanor calm but purposeful. He approached the lead guard and whispered, "We've got a situation. Quietly start clearing the room. No alarms." The guard nodded, signaling his team. Thomas moved through the crowd, speaking softly to key personnel. "Please, make your way to the exits. This is a precautionary measure." Guests began to leave in small groups, their expressions curious but composed. Thomas felt a pang of relief. So far, the evacuation was working. But as he neared the dais where several dignitaries were seated, his radio crackled. "Thomas," Ellie's voice came through urgent. "We found one of the devices. It's in the ballroom." His stomach
dropped.
"Where?" "We're still pinpointing, but it's near the central chandelier." Thomas glanced up. The massive crystal chandelier was a centerpiece of the room, its glittering lights reflecting across the ornate ceiling. If the bomb was up there, the blast would bring down the entire structure. "Get the bomb squad here now," he said, his voice tight. "I'm going up." "Are you crazy?" Ellie replied. "You're not trained for this." "There's no time," Thomas snapped. "Keep me posted." Thomas spotted a maintenance ladder tucked into a corner of the ballroom. He climbed quickly, his hands trembling as he neared the ceiling. The music below had stopped, the evacuation nearly complete. Guards were sweeping the room for stragglers, their movements brisk but controlled. Reaching the top, Thomas pulled himself onto the narrow ledge that ran along the ceiling's edge. The chandelier loomed ahead, its intricate framework casting long shadows in the dim light. He inched forward, his balance precarious. "Ellie, I need more information," he said, sweat dripping down his face.
"Where's
the device?" "Check the base of the chandelier," Ellie replied. "It's magnetic, should be easy to spot." Thomas reached the chandelier and clung to the frame, his heart pounding. He scanned the structure, his flashlight catching a glint of metal. There it was, a small, cylindrical device with blinking red lights. "I've got it," he said into the radio. "Timer's at 3 minutes. Thomas, get out of there," Ellie shouted. "No time. I'll disarm it." "You're not trained for that," she protested. "Walk me through it," he insisted, his voice firm. "Tell me what to do?" Ellie hesitated, then relented. "Okay. Look for a panel on the device. It'll have wires." Thomas found the panel and pried it open, revealing a tangle of red, blue, and yellow wires. His hands shook as he positioned his flashlight. "Now what?" "Carefully follow the blue wire to its base," Ellie instructed. "There should be a small node. You need to cut it, but only after securing the capacitor." "Securing the capacitor?" "English, Ellie." "The silver cylinder on the side," she said quickly. "Hold it steady while you cut, or the bomb will detonate." Thomas gritted his teeth, holding the capacitor with one hand while maneuvering his pocket knife with the other. The timer ticked down 2 minutes. "Steady," Ellie said, her voice tense. "Cut the blue wire." Slowly, Thomas sliced through the wire, his breath catching. The timer stopped. "It's done," he said, relief flooding his
voice.
But before he could climb down, his radio crackled again. This time, it was Graham. "Thomas, there's another device. It's under the ballroom floor." The ground team had discovered the second bomb while sweeping the area. It was larger than the first, its timer synchronized to detonate moments after the chandelier device. If it went off, the damage would be
catastrophic.
Thomas scrambled down the ladder, his legs shaky. "What's the timer on the second device?" he asked, rushing toward the center of the ballroom. 1 minute, Graham replied. "Bomb squad still en route." Thomas reached the team, clustered around a trapdoor in the floor. He yanked it open, revealing the bomb nestled among the wooden beams. This one was more complex, its circuitry layered and intricate. "Ellie, I need you again," he said, his voice tight. "This one's different," Ellie said, scanning the live feed from the ground team's cameras. "You'll need to deactivate the pressure plate first." "Pressure plate," Thomas echoed, eyeing the bomb. "The metal pad underneath it," Ellie explained.
"It's
designed to trigger the bomb if it's tampered with." Thomas exhaled sharply, his mind racing. "What do I do?" "You need to wedge something under the plate to hold the pressure while you disarm the circuitry," Ellie said. Carefully, Thomas grabbed a piece of wood from the debris nearby and slid it under the plate, holding his breath as it clicked into place. The timer read 30 seconds. "Now the wires," Ellie said. "Same process, but you'll need to cut the red wire first." Thomas's hands trembled as he worked. He located the red wire and cut it, the timer pausing briefly before resuming. Sweat dripped into his eyes as Ellie guided him through the sequence. Yellow, then green. With 5 seconds left, Thomas severed the final wire. The bomb went silent. "It's disarmed," he said, collapsing onto the floor. Around him, the guards cheered, their relief palpable. But Thomas's radio crackled again, this time with a chilling message. "We commend your efforts," a distorted voice said, unmistakably from the Purity Order. "But you're too late. The real target is already in motion." Thomas bolted upright, dread consuming him. "What real target?" The voice laughed coldly. "You'll see soon enough."
At that
moment, an explosion rocked the east wing of the palace, sending shockwaves through the entire structure. The explosion reverberated through the palace, shaking the very foundation. Thomas barely had time to steady himself as the floor beneath him trembled. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and muffled screams echoed from the east wing. "Report." Graham's voice boomed through the radio. "Explosion in the east wing," Thomas replied, adrenaline spiking. "I'm heading there now." "You're not cleared for that area," Graham barked. "It's unstable." "With all due respect, sir, I'm going," Thomas shot back, already sprinting toward the east wing. He could feel the urgency in his chest, This wasn't just another warning. The Purity Order was escalating, and the East Wing could hold vital clues to their endgame. Smoke filled the air as Thomas reached the East Wing, coughing as he pushed through the haze. The ornate hallway was in ruins, sections of the ceiling caved in, and splintered wood littered the ground. Flames flickered in the distance, casting eerie shadows across the
Debris.
He spotted a security guard slumped against a wall, his face pale and bloodied. Thomas rushed to him. "Are you
Hurt.
The man shook his head weakly. Explosion came out of nowhere. They hit the archives.
I think they wanted.
Something? The archives? Thomas repeated, his mind racing. The East Wing housed some of the palace's most guarded documents, historical treaties, royal correspondences. If the Purity Order had targeted this area, they weren't just making a statement. They were after something specific. Thomas helped the guard to his feet and handed him off to medics who had arrived on the scene. He continued deeper into the wing, navigating through the wreckage. The once grand archive room was now a gaping hole of destruction. Shelves had toppled, and ancient documents lay scattered, some smoldering from the heat. As Thomas scanned the room, he noticed a peculiar gap in the debris. A section of the floor had been cleared deliberately. In its place was an open safe, its steel door hanging ajar. The contents were
Gone.
"Ellie," Thomas said into his radio, his voice urgent. "They took something from the archives. I need a list of what was stored here." "I'm on it," Ellie replied. Moments later, her voice came through again. Most of it was historical records, but there's one item flagged as high security. A dossier marked Project Albion. Thomas froze. "What's Project Albion?" There was a pause. "It's classified," Ellie admitted. "But the notes suggest it contains details on counterterrorism operations and intelligence assets. If they've got it, they've got the playbook to dismantle our entire security infrastructure," Thomas finished grimly. Outside the palace, chaos reigned. Emergency personnel swarmed the area, tending to the injured and securing the grounds. Tourists had been evacuated, and news crews gathered at the perimeter, their cameras capturing the devastation. Graham approached Thomas as he exited the East Wing, his expression tight. "What's the situation?" "They hit the archives and took a classified dossier, Project Albion," Thomas reported. "If they've got this intel, they're planning something massive." Graham's face darkened. "That's not just palace security, it's the entire nation's intelligence network." Thomas nodded. "We need to move fast. They're not done." Ellie's voice crackled through their earpieces. "I've traced communications linked to the Purity Order. They're coordinating through an encrypted channel, but I've managed to pinpoint their next location, a safe house outside the city." Graham wasted no time.
"We're taking the fight to them."
"Thomas, you're with me?" The convoy sped through the streets, sirens wailing. Thomas sat in the passenger seat of an armored vehicle, his mind racing. If the Purity Order had the Project Albion dossier, they could expose agents, disrupt counterterrorism efforts, and plan attacks with precision. This wasn't just an attack on the monarchy. It was an assault on the nation's stability. The safe house was tucked away in an industrial district, a nondescript building that blended in with its surroundings. As the convoy approached, Graham briefed the team.
"This is a
surgical strike. We go in fast, secure the intel, and neutralize all threats. No mistakes." Thomas checked his gear, his grip tightening on his weapon. He felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but there was no room for doubt. Lives were at stake. The team moved swiftly, breaching the building's entrance. Inside, the safe house was a hive of activity. Members of the Purity Order scrambled to grab weapons and documents as the tactical team stormed in. "Freeze!" Thomas shouted, his weapon trained on a man reaching for a rifle. The man hesitated, then lunged forward. Thomas fired, the shot hitting the man's shoulder and sending him crashing to the ground. Gunfire erupted as the team engaged the extremists. The air was thick with tension, the confined space amplifying every sound. Thomas moved through the chaos, his focus laser-sharp. He entered a back room and found what he'd been dreading, a makeshift command center. Maps, blueprints, and the stolen Project Albion dossier were spread across a table. A computer terminal displayed a countdown timer, its numbers ticking away. "Ellie, I've got a bomb here," Thomas said into his radio. "And a timer. What's the protocol?" Ellie's voice was tense. "You need to disable it. Check the wiring." Thomas's hands trembled as he examined the device. The countdown read 2 o'clock. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. "Ellie, there's more," he added. "This isn't the only bomb. They've got locations marked on the map." "What kind of locations?" Ellie asked. Thomas scanned the map. "Train stations, airports, public squares. They're planning simultaneous attacks." The gravity of the situation hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just about the palace anymore. This was an attack on the entire city. As the timer ticked down, Thomas worked quickly to disable the bomb. Sweat dripped down his face as Ellie guided him through the process. With just seconds to spare, he cut the final wire and the timer froze at 0:01. "Bombs disarmed," he said, exhaling deeply. "Good work," Ellie replied. "But we've got a bigger problem now. Those other bombs, if we don't stop them." "We will," Thomas interrupted, his voice resolute. "We have to." But even as he spoke, he knew time was running out. The Purity Order had planned this meticulously, and the city was on the brink of catastrophe. The command center was a chaotic mess of evidence, hastily scribbled plans, and discarded weapons. Thomas stood over the disarmed bomb, his mind racing as he tried to piece everything together. The map on the table in front of him was marked with red dots, each one representing a major public site. Ellie's voice crackled through his earpiece. "Thomas, I've cross-referenced those locations. They're targeting high-traffic areas: Paddington Station, Heathrow Airport, Trafalgar Square. These are simultaneous hits." Thomas clenched his jaw. "What's the estimated timeline?" Ellie hesitated. "If their plan is synchronized with the bomb you just disarmed, we're looking at less than 90 minutes. Graham entered the room, his face grim. "We've secured the building and captured a few of their members alive. But if they've already deployed operatives to those locations, we'll never reach all the targets in time." Thomas scanned the room, his eyes landing on a computer terminal still active. He rushed over, pulling up the encrypted communications. The screen was filled with messages from the Purity Order, some in code, others more direct. "This might help," Thomas said, pointing to the screen. "Ellie, can you remote into the system?" "On it," Ellie replied, her keyboard clicking in the background. "Give me a second." "Okay, I'm in." "These messages are coordinating the attacks. If I can intercept their signal, I might be able to isolate their operatives' locations." "How long?" Graham asked, urgency in his tone. 15 minutes, maybe less," Ellie replied. "But I can't promise anything." Thomas looked at Graham. "We don't have a choice. We need to split up and cover as many sites as possible. Ellie can feed us intel on the go." Graham nodded. "Let's move." Thomas's team loaded into vehicles, sirens blaring as they sped through the streets. The tension in the air was palpable, every second ticking away like the countdown on a bomb. Thomas was headed to Paddington Station, one of the busiest transport hubs in the city. "Ellie, do we have anything on Paddington yet?" he asked, gripping the dashboard as the vehicle swerved through traffic. "Not yet," Ellie replied, "but I've picked up chatter indicating operatives are already in place." As they approached the station, Thomas could see the chaos unfolding. Commuters were being evacuated, but the crowds only made the scene more chaotic. Armed officers were ushering people out while others searched for the bomb. Thomas pushed his way through the throng, his earpiece crackling with updates. "Ellie, where's the device?" "I'm scanning CCTV feeds," she said quickly. "It's near the West Concourse." possibly hidden in a luggage locker. Thomas sprinted toward the west concourse, his eyes scanning every corner. He spotted the lockers, a row of metal doors, stretching across the wall. The area had been cordoned off, but there was no sign of the bomb squad. He stepped closer, his
heart pounding.
Among the sea of identical lockers, one stood out. It had a faint smear of dirt on the handle, as if it had been handled recently. "Ellie, I think I've got it," he said, kneeling in front of the locker. "Wait for the bomb squad," Ellie insisted.
"There's no time," Thomas replied.
"Talk me through this." He pried the locker open, revealing a small, sophisticated device nestled inside. The timer read 10:23. He grabbed his multi-tool, preparing to disarm it.
"Ellie, what
am I looking at?" "Same design as before," she said. "Start with a pressure plate. Stabilize it before touching the wiring." Thomas wedged a small metal bar under the plate, holding it steady. His hands trembled as he moved to the wires, carefully cutting each one as Ellie instructed. The timer ticked down to 0:45 before the device finally powered down. "It's done," he said, exhaling sharply. "Good," Ellie replied. "But there are still 2 more locations.
I've sent teams to
Trafalgar Square and Heathrow. What about the operatives?"
Thomas asked.
"I'm tracing their communications now," Ellie
said.
"But it's hard to pinpoint their exact positions." At Heathrow Airport, chaos erupted as travelers were evacuated. Officers swarmed the terminals, searching for the bomb. Meanwhile, in Trafalgar Square, crowds celebrating a cultural festival were being rushed away by emergency personnel. Ellie's voice came through the comms. "The operatives at Heathrow
are using a decoy to buy time.
The real device is in Terminal 3. You've got less than 10 minutes. Meanwhile, the situation at Trafalgar Square was escalating. Officers spotted a suspect moving toward the festival stage with a large duffel bag. When approached, the man dropped the bag and bolted, disappearing into the crowd. Thomas's radio crackled with updates from both teams. "Suspect at Trafalgar fled into the underground," one officer reported. "Device still active at the site. Bomb squad en route to Heathrow, but time's running out," another said. Thomas raced back to his vehicle, preparing to join the team at Trafalgar Square. As he sped through the city, Ellie's voice broke through the static. "Thomas, we've got a major problem," she said, her tone urgent. "What now?" he asked, gripping the wheel. "I've intercepted another message from the Purity Order. They've activated a failsafe, a secondary wave of attacks in case these bombs are stopped." "What's the target?" Thomas demanded. "Everything," Ellie replied. "They've scattered smaller devices throughout the city. Public transit, bridges, shopping centers. This isn't just about the monarchy anymore, it's about total chaos." Thomas gritted his teeth, his determination hardening. "Then we stop it. All of it." But even as he said the words, the enormity of the challenge loomed over him. With bombs already planted, operatives on the loose, and the city in a state of panic, stopping the Purity Order's final plan would take everything he had, and more. Thomas sped toward Trafalgar Square, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The city was unraveling around him. Sirens wailed in the distance, helicopters circled overhead, and streets were clogged with people fleeing for safety. His earpiece buzzed constantly with updates, each one more dire than the last. Ellie's voice cut through the chaos. "Thomas, we've identified some of the smaller devices scattered across the city. Teams are being dispatched, but we're spread thin." "How many devices are we talking about?" Thomas asked, weaving through traffic. "Over a dozen," Ellie replied grimly. "They've hidden them in public places. Train stations, shopping malls, parks. They're trying to overwhelm us." Thomas tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "Do we know who's coordinating this?" "There's no way Darren planned this alone." Ellie hesitated. "We've decrypted some of their communications. The orders are coming from someone they call the Arbiter. No real name yet, but they're pulling the strings." Thomas's mind raced. Darren was just the face of the operation, a pawn in a much larger game. If they didn't Take down the Arbiter. This chaos would only escalate. As he approached Trafalgar Square, Thomas saw the remnants of the festival, abandoned stalls, overturned tables, and scattered decorations. The square, usually bustling with life, was eerily silent save for the hum of emergency vehicles. Status? Thomas asked over his radio as he stepped out of the car.
An
officer on site replied, "We've secured the perimeter, but the device is still active. Bomb squad's 2 minutes out." Thomas moved quickly toward the stage, where the duffel bag sat ominously. The crowd had dispersed, but the tension hung
heavy in the air.
The timer on the device read 3:12. "Ellie, I need guidance," Thomas said, kneeling beside the bag.
I'm
"Pulling up the schematics now," Ellie replied. "It's a variation of the devices you've seen, but this one's more advanced. There's a secondary mechanism. It'll trigger if tampered with improperly." "Of course there is," Thomas muttered.
walk me
"Through it. Start by disabling the primary timer," Ellie said. "But be careful. The secondary mechanism is pressure sensitive. Any sudden movement could set it off." Thomas carefully opened the bag, revealing a tangle of wires and a small vial of liquid connected to the circuitry. His stomach tightened. It was a chemical explosive, far more volatile than the previous devices. "Ellie, what's the trigger for the secondary mechanism?" he asked, sweat dripping down his face. "It's connected to the vial," Ellie explained. "If it tilts or breaks, the bomb goes off." Thomas's hands trembled as he stabilized the vial with one hand and cut the wires with the other. The timer ticked down 00:45, 00:30, 0:15. "Almost there," Ellie said, her voice steady. "Cut the red wire, then secure the vial." With a deep breath, Thomas made the final
cut.
The timer stopped at 0:03. "It's disarmed," Thomas said, collapsing onto the stage. Relief washed over him, but it
Was short-lived.
His radio crackled with an urgent update. "This is Unit 4 at Heathrow. We've got the device in Terminal 3, but we're pinned down. Multiple hostiles in the area." Another voice came through. "Unit 7 at London Bridge. We've located another device, but we've got a live operative threatening to detonate it manually." Ellie chimed in. "Thomas, we're running out of time. These aren't just random bombs. They're coordinated to go off together. If even one detonates, it could trigger a chain reaction." Thomas stood, determination hardening his features. "Then we split up and handle them
all."
Thomas raced toward Heathrow Airport, joining the tactical team at Terminal 3. The scene was chaotic. Travelers huddled behind barricades as officers exchanged gunfire with operatives from the Purity Order. "Where's the device?"
Thomas
shouted over the commotion. "Near Gate 14, an officer replied. "But they've got it rigged to a remote detonator. We can't get close without disabling it." Thomas spotted the device, a suitcase tucked under a row of chairs. One of the operatives held a remote in his hand, his finger hovering over the button. Thomas raised his weapon and aimed for the operative's
hand.
With a single, precise shot, the remote flew from the man's grip. The team moved in, subduing the operatives while Thomas rushed to the suitcase. He opened it, his stomach sinking as he saw the familiar tangle of wires and a timer. Reading 1 o'clock. "Ellie, I need you again," Thomas said, his voice tight. "I'm here," Ellie replied. "This one's similar to the others, but the trigger mechanism is a bit more complex. Cut the green wire first, then stabilize the capacitor." Thomas followed her instructions, his hands steady despite the chaos around him. The timer ticked down 00:10, 00:05, 0:02. The device powered down. Thomas exhaled sharply, but there was no time to rest. His radio crackled again with updates from other teams still racing against the clock. Meanwhile, Graham's unit cornered a high-ranking member of the Purity Order in an abandoned warehouse. The man was defiant, refusing to answer questions even as officers restrained him. "You think you've won," the man sneered. The Arbiter is already 3 steps ahead of you. Graham leaned in. Where is the Arbiter? What's the next move? The man smirked. You'll never find them, but you'll know when they strike. As the final bombs were disarmed and the last operatives captured, Thomas felt a momentary sense of relief. But the Purity Order's threat was far from over. The Arbiter remained elusive, their plans shrouded in secrecy. Back at headquarters, Ellie pulled Thomas aside. We decrypted another message. It's a direct order from the Arbiter. What does it say?
Thomas asked.
Ellie's face was pale as she read the message aloud. Phase 1 is complete. Phase 2 begins at dawn. Thomas's heart
sank.
The battle was far from over.